Picture a bay above the Arctic Circle. Quiet water, rocky shores, not a living soul for dozens of kilometers around. And beneath that water, and right there on the shore, lie dozens of nuclear reactors. Some of them are still loaded with fuel. Some have rusted to the point where contact with air alone could set them off. And one submarine, resting at a depth of nearly 2 kilometers, still cries radioactive cesium into the water every few years. A process scientists are still studying today. This isn't the plot of a science fiction film. This is a real place. Or rather, a whole network of places on the Kola Peninsula and in the Kara and Norwegian Seas. Journalists and environmentalists have called it a nuclear graveyard, the largest concentration of abandoned nuclear reactors in the world. For decades, people tried not to talk about it out loud. But in recent years, this story has made headlines again. Some say the threat has finally been brought under control. Others say the most dangerous phase has only just begun. So what actually happened to this graveyard? Who created it and why? Why did it nearly cause an environmental catastrophe? And has the danger really become a thing of the past? Let's go through it step by step to understand where this graveyard came from. We need to go back to the Cold War era. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union began mass-producing nuclear submarines for its northern fleet. It was an arms race. Every new submarine came with a new, more powerful reactor, capable of keeping the sub underwater for months without surfacing. The base for this fleet became the Kola Peninsula, a harsh, sparsely populated region in northwestern Russia, just a few dozen kilometers from the Norwegian border. It was here, in a bay called Andreeva Bay, roughly 55 kilometers from Murmansk, that a coastal technical base was established in 1961. Its task was simple on paper and extraordinarily dangerous in practice: to receive spent nuclear fuel from submarines, fuel that had already served its purpose in a reactor but remained lethally radioactive, and store it until it could be processed further. The problem was that in the Soviet Union, the process of reprocessing and disposing of nuclear waste always lagged behind the pace at which it was produced. The fleet grew faster than storage facilities could be built, and for decades, spent fuel simply piled up, first in special pools, then out in the open, in containers that went unmoved for years. And when even that became too much, the simplest way to get rid of the problem was used: the sea. Over the course of several decades, thousands of tons of solid and liquid radioactive waste were dumped into the Kara Sea, the waters north of Russia, between Novaya Zemlya and the mainland. According to researchers' estimates, at least 14 unwanted nuclear reactors were sent there, some still containing remnants of fuel, along with one entire damaged submarine. The total amount of radioactivity dumped into these waters, by some estimates, is several times greater than what was released during the bombing of Hiroshima. Soviet authorities denied the scale of the problem for years. The world only learned the true extent of the dumping in the early 1990s, when the Iron Curtain fell and the Russian government, by then post-Soviet, acknowledged what had been concealed for decades. And Andreeva Bay was far from the only such site. Another base operated on the Kola Peninsula, in the settlement of Gremika, where fuel from decommissioned submarines with unique, experimental reactors was stored. And in the Far East, in Pavlovsky Bay near Vladivostok, a similar base served the Pacific Fleet. It was there, in the neighboring Chazhma Bay, that one of the most covered-up nuclear disasters of the Cold War occurred in 1985. On August 10, 1985, aboard the submarine K-431, docked at a ship repair yard near the settlement of Dune in the Far East, crews were carrying out a routine operation, replacing nuclear fuel in the reactor. Due to a violation of procedure, an uncontrolled chain reaction started. The reactor essentially exploded. At least 10 people were killed, and dozens more were exposed to radiation. A radioactive cloud spread over the shipyard and part of the coastline. The accident was kept so tightly under wraps that the world only learned about it 8 years later, when information finally leaked to the press. On the International Nuclear Event Scale, the disaster was rated level 5, the same level as, for example, the 3 Mile Island accident in the United States, and it's often called the Pacific Harbinger of Chernobyl, since it happened just a year before the Chernobyl explosion. The damaged submarine was towed to nearby Pavlovsky Bay, and its reactor compartment was filled with concrete, and that, it would seem, should have been the end of the story. But the submarine wasn't actually scrapped until 25 years later, when the reactor compartment was cut out and sent off for storage for decades to come. And that's just one of the known accidents. In February 1982, a leak occurred at the storage facility in Andreeva Bay itself. An estimated 700,000 liters of radioactively contaminated liquid leaked into the bay and the Barents Sea. Attempts to contain the leak used makeshift methods, and the problem was never fully resolved. The site remained one of the most radioactively dangerous spots in northwestern Russia for years afterward. But perhaps the most famous and most tragic story to come out of this graveyard is that of the submarine K-278, better known as Komsomolets. It was a unique vessel, the only one of its class, with a titanium alloy hull that allowed it to dive deeper than any other submarine of its time. On April 7, 1989, while on combat patrol in the Norwegian Sea, a fire broke out on board. The crew fought to save the ship for hours. The submarine even managed to surface, but it eventually sank, taking the lives of 42 of the 69 crew members aboard. The submarine took its nuclear reactor down with it, to a depth of roughly 1,680 meters, along with, according to available data, 2 torpedoes carrying nuclear warheads. And here we arrive at the most remarkable and most unsettling part of this story. Komsomolets isn't just lying on the seafloor. Even now, more than 35 years after the disaster, it periodically breathes out radiation. Norwegian scientists, who have spent years monitoring the site using underwater vehicles, have documented that the reactor continues to release radioactive isotopes, including cesium, a process linked to corrosion of the metal structures inside the hull. According to the latest research, the releases happen irregularly, in bursts, and so far no significant buildup of radionuclides has been detected right around the wreck. The contamination appears to dilute quickly in the surrounding ocean. But scientists warn that the hull will keep weakening over time, and conditions at that depth make any kind of repair or additional sealing essentially impossible. In other words, the situation can only be watched. Humanity currently has no way to actually intervene at a depth of nearly 2 kilometers. When the world finally saw the real numbers in the early 1990s, it became clear this wasn't a matter of isolated accidents. It was a systemic catastrophe that had been building for decades. At that point, Andreeva Bay alone had accumulated around 22,000 spent fuel assemblies, enough, by some estimates, to fill the reactor cores of Russia's entire active nuclear fleet several times over. Much of this fuel wasn't even stored in proper containers. It sat in half-ruined Soviet-era buildings, some of which hadn't been updated since they were built in the 1960s. At the same time, dozens of decommissioned nuclear submarines, still with fuel loaded in their reactors, sat idle right at the piers of the Northern and Pacific fleets. Because of funding shortages, Russia in the 1990s simply didn't have the money to decommission them through proper procedures. The submarines rusted at their moorings. Some partially sank right there at the docks. The main danger wasn't a single catastrophic explosion, although, as the K-431 accident showed, that risk was very real, but a slow, invisible threat. Corrosion of the metal containers and hulls could lead to an uncontrolled release of radioactive material straight into the Barents Sea, from where ocean currents carry water throughout the Arctic and beyond, toward the coast of Norway, and in theory, further still. This prospect alarmed not just Russia, but the entire Western world, and above all, its closest neighbor, Norway. That's why, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, one of the largest international environmental cleanup operations in history began, clearing away the Soviet nuclear legacy on the Kola Peninsula. The initiative was driven above all by Norway, a country for which a radiation accident in neighboring Russia would mean a direct threat to its own coastal waters and fisheries, an industry that is critically important to the Norwegian economy. The Norwegian government began funding infrastructure upgrade projects in Chazhma Bay as early as the early 2000s. Later, the European Union and a number of other countries joined the effort, channeling support through a special international nuclear safety partnership mechanism. The money went toward very concrete things: building new transport containers for the fuel, rebuilding piers, constructing protective structures over old storage facilities, and purchasing specialized vessels. One symbol of this cooperation is the ship Rosetta, a specialized container vessel built specifically to transport hazardous cargo from the Kola Peninsula. For years, it has shuttled between Chazhma Bay and Murmansk, from where the cargo continues on to the Mayak reprocessing plant in the Urals. The practical phase of removing spent fuel from Chazhma Bay began in 2017, and that moment is rightly considered a turning point. For the first time in more than half a century of the base's existence, the most dangerous material, which had simply been sitting there for years, waiting for an accident to happen, began to be systematically removed. At the same time, the fate of the decommissioned submarines themselves was being addressed. The simplest cases, reactor compartments with fuel already unloaded, were cut out of the hulls and sent for long-term storage at a specially built facility inside a bay, also on the Kola Peninsula. This, in effect, became a new, far safer graveyard, this time an organized one, with concrete storage pads and ongoing monitoring, rather than something simply abandoned to its fate. If we sum up the progress of recent years, the picture looks like this. Between 2017 and 2022, 18 train convoys carrying spent fuel were removed from Chazhma Bay, and in total, according to official figures, more than 200 containers of fuel have now been shipped out of the site. That's an enormous amount of work that would have seemed impossible just 30 years ago. A separate story is the decommissioning of the floating technical base LEPS, an old vessel that, since Soviet times, had served as a floating storage facility for spent fuel and had long been considered one of the most dangerous floating structures in the world. The project to dismantle and dispose of it, which also involved international partners, took roughly 10 years and was completed in 2023. Still, the most difficult and most dangerous part of the work in Chazhma Bay lies ahead. It concerns the so-called Container 3A units, containers holding the most damaged fuel assemblies. According to estimates by British experts brought in to assess the risk, the total quantity of radionuclides in these containers is comparable to the radioactive material remaining inside the sarcophagus over Chernobyl's fourth reactor. This isn't an exaggeration. It's one of the most dangerous nuclear sites on the planet, and the work of extracting this fuel is considered the riskiest stage of the entire operation. And here we arrive at what has made this story especially relevant right now. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, international cooperation on cleaning up the Kola Peninsula effectively came to a halt. Norway, the EU, and other Western partners, who had spent years funding and technically supporting this work, cut off cooperation with Russia as part of sanctions policy. The consequences weren't long in coming. The pace of fuel removal dropped sharply. Where previously several train convoys had left Chazhma Bay each year, in the first year after the invasion, only 2 did. As of 2022, roughly 9,500 cubic meters of solid radioactive waste still remained at the site, a little over half of everything that had accumulated there over the decades. Under pre-war plans, all of this waste was supposed to be removed by 2026. Those deadlines now look highly uncertain. Russia is trying to continue the work on its own, and according to some reports, fuel removal is still ongoing. But now without the international funding and technical support that much of the project had relied on for the past 2 decades. But even if the removal of fuel from coastal bases is eventually completed, there's an even bigger problem left: what's still lying on the seafloor. We're talking about 2 submarines that have never been raised. K-27, an experimental submarine with a liquid metal-cooled reactor, which, after a series of accidents and radiation leaks, was scuttled in the Kara Sea, its reactor first sealed with resin, and K-159, which sank in 2003 while being towed for decommissioning, going down with fuel still on board. According to experts, the resin seal on K-27's reactor is guaranteed to hold only until around 2032, after which a fuel leak becomes possible, and in the worst-case scenario, some experts don't even rule out a localized chain reaction right there on the seabed. That's why, in recent years, Russia has been talking more and more seriously about a massive and extraordinarily expensive project to raise both submarines from the Arctic seafloor, an operation with almost no precedent in world practice. And, of course, there's still Komsomolets in the Norwegian Sea, a submarine that simply cannot be raised or repaired at a depth of nearly 2 kilometers, and which remains under constant scientific observation for the simple reason that, so far, there's no other option. Before we wrap up, it's worth pausing on a question a lot of viewers ask at this point. How exactly would anyone raise a submarine like K-27 or K-159 from the Arctic seabed? And is this kind of nuclear graveyard problem something only Russia has ever had to deal with? Let's start with the engineering side, because it's genuinely staggering. Both submarines lie at depths of around 30 to 50 meters, shallow enough, in theory, to reach with divers and remotely operated vehicles. But that's actually where the real danger lies. A deep-sea wreck like Komsomolets, resting at 1,680 meters, is in some ways safer simply because it's essentially unreachable. Nobody can disturb it, intentionally or otherwise. K-27 and K-159, by contrast, sit in relatively shallow, increasingly busy Arctic waters, close to shipping lanes that are only getting busier as sea ice retreats. That proximity is exactly why Russian officials have grown more anxious about them. A wreck that's reachable is also a wreck that's exposed to fishing trawlers, anchors, storms, and simple metal fatigue. The proposed method for raising them draws on techniques used in the past for lifting other Cold War-era wrecks, attaching pontoons or specialized lifting frames to the hull, using controlled buoyancy to bring the vessel to the surface gradually, then transporting it, likely still partially submerged, to avoid direct exposure, to a facility equipped to handle the fuel removal safely. The nuclear fuel itself would then need to be unloaded underwater or in a specially built dry dock, using remote handling equipment, since human access to the reactor compartments could involve fatal radiation doses. The catch is cost. Engineering estimates for a project of this scale, for both submarines combined, have run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's before accounting for the near total absence of Western technical partners since 2022. Historically, one of the few comparable precedents was the Soviet Union's own 1968 salvage attempt of the American submarine that everyone assumed was unraisable. But that's a different story entirely, and one shrouded in even more secrecy. So, is this graveyard unique to Russia? Not entirely, though it is unmatched in scale. The United States ran its own large-scale nuclear submarine disposal program starting in the late 1980s, primarily through a naval shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, where retired Cold War-era submarines were defueled and their reactor compartments cut out, sealed, and shipped by barge to a dedicated land storage site in the desert of eastern Washington state. A process that, notably, never involved dumping reactors into the ocean. The United Kingdom faced a smaller but strikingly similar problem. For years, a number of Britain's own decommissioned nuclear submarines sat afloat, defueled but otherwise untouched, at naval yards, simply because the country lacked a long-term disposal site. A political and logistical bottleneck that persisted for decades and drew its own share of public criticism. The key difference is this: the American and British programs, whatever their delays, generally kept the radioactive material out of the sea. The Soviet approach, dumping reactors and, in places, entire vessels directly into Arctic waters, is what makes Russia's version of this story categorically more dangerous and considerably harder to fully resolve. There's one more factor that makes this problem more urgent with each passing year, and it has nothing to do with politics. The Arctic itself is changing. Rising temperatures are opening Arctic shipping routes to far more traffic than existed even 2 decades ago, and permafrost that once helped stabilize some coastal storage sites is thawing. Neither trend makes any of this easier. More ship traffic near K 27 and K 159 means more risk of an accidental strike on a fragile hull. A warmer, more accessible Arctic means the margin for delay keeps shrinking, even as the political will and funding to act keep shrinking right along with it. What ultimately happened to the graveyard of nuclear submarines? In part, it stopped being chaotic and uncontrolled. Thanks to years of international cooperation, the most dangerous sites on land are gradually being cleared. Fuel is being removed, and decommissioned reactor compartments are now stored in an organized, monitored way, instead of simply rusting away in the open or on the seabed. But in part, this story remains unfinished, and it looks like it will stay that way for a long time. The most hazardous nuclear material in Chazhma Bay is still waiting to be extracted. 2 submarines lie on the bottom of the Kara Sea, their reactor's window of safe silence running out. And Komsomolets, in the Norwegian Sea, keeps reminding the world of its presence every few years, simply because humanity still hasn't figured out how to clean up after some of the Cold War's mistakes. This story isn't just about the past. It's a reminder of just how thin the line is between a hidden, forgotten problem and a disaster waiting for the right moment, and of how international cooperation, even between countries that don't always trust each other, can sometimes be the only thing standing between us and crossing that line. If you found this interesting, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Should we cover the story of Soviet nuclear icebreakers next? Another little-known chapter with a strikingly similar history?